the goal is to get to net zero carbon usage. We need to not just talk about where we need to be as a final goal, but some of the pathways of how we're going to get there. What are we trying to say? We're trying to say that we actually need to reduce the amount of carbon released from carbon sinks into the atmosphere in the capture, transport, storage, and transformation of energy into work. We're not talking about hydrogen or anything. We're actually talking about energy. So we need energy from one place where it exists to another place and at a later time, and somewhere could be quite distant. And we don't need that energy just for energy. We need to then transform that into some sort of work, whether that's mobility or electricity or heat or feedstock for chemical industry. So we're talking about the energy transfer. Secondly, carbon itself is not the problem. As Michael pointed out, the carbon actually has a lot of value in the energy intensity that it brings, but also the use of carbon itself. What we're talking about is the carbon that is from a carbon sink being released to the atmosphere. Let's talk more about carbon intensity reduction. Not 100% green, not net zero. Let's talk about our carbon intensity reduction. So when we look at that, it opens up the pathway a little bit for how we can move forward. So now we can break it into some smaller iterations, which I think is one of the problems that we've seen and talked about a lot in terms of scalability, is we need to be able to amortize projects. We need projects that are discrete and finite and biteable, that we can actually get investment in it. And that investment needs to have a finite time and a return. And when we say it's got to be 100% green or nothing, effectively that makes the investment in these projects very, very difficult. Take our electricity grid on the east coast of Australia. You could say iteration one was putting renewables into our grid, and we're at something like 25%. The next iteration is probably actually having to put in thermal generation, gas-fired peakers and the like, to allow us to have the grid stability, the inertia, the flexibility to be able to incorporate more renewables into our grid. Now, if we talk about net zero or 100% green, we cannot talk about new gas-fired peakers going into our grid, because that's, to use the German word verboten, we're not allowed to talk about that. But if we talk about how we reduce our carbon intensity in our grid, those pathways open up. Now we talk about, putting in the flexible generation we need to increase our renewable penetration. And then an iteration 3 might be, let's look at those fuels that we have for peaking and how can we green them? How can we turn that that natural gas into synthetic methane or hydrogen or methanol or some of the other options? And again, it breaks it into amortizable projects. When we talk about iterations, one aspect of iterations, and again, to say it again, there is no one solution. But iteration 1, I think, should be, let's utilize the carbon we have in a more effective way. So instead of it going ground to air, let's get a loop out of it. Let's capture it and reuse it. Let's do something else with it. And perhaps iteration 2 is getting 2 loops or more loops out of it. And by that way, we're talking about reducing our carbon intensity in a way that actually makes for meaningful projects moving forward. So what does that all mean in terms of realities? We have renewable energy as the backbone of what we have. And batteries will play a big role in that. A battery is fantastic, but what it can do is store energy locally and for a short time. But what we're talking about is energy transfer. So we need to get energy from where it's available or being produced to converting it into something else at a later time and in a different place. So of course, batteries can't help in that part of the discussion. Is hydrogen okay on its own? Should we be converting it? I think one of the things that's lost a lot in the discussion is the transport and storage does get talked about a bit, and we have to be honest that we're talking about trillions of dollars of infrastructure that needs to be invested in. And one of the big aspects that doesn't get talked about a lot is actually the energy conversion. What can we do with these fuels? But then in the energy conversion, we also understand how you can turn those different fuels back into work. And to be honest, things like ammonia are very, very difficult to burn. So there's a whole lot more to the picture that we think needs to be brought into the discussion in what is the right mix. But if we now get back to our iterations, perhaps iteration 1 is we utilize the carbon dioxide that we have from existing sources, whether it's a natural gas field or industry, and we use that together with hydrogen that's comes from a green source, and we turn that into some sort of fuel that actually has the energy density that we need, because the energy is the key, not the actual medium itself. But it also has the transport and storage scale, and also the ability to convert it back into work in the short to medium term. And so that's where we're looking at things like methanol and methane, I think, actually playing a massive role, because they have the transport and energy storage network, and also they're readily convertible into the various forms of work that we need. So if that's iteration one, and then iteration two might be we add some direct air capture. So then direct air capture becomes part of the discussion, and now we're talking about completely green sources of carbon dioxide, but we've done it in a stepwise iterative approach. So basically, that brings me to really what I wanted to talk about today. Is there's a lot of things that need to be done, and we at MAN are as passionate as anybody about starting. Let's talk more about our carbon intensity in our energy flow, and how do we reduce the amount of carbon, or how much carbon is required for a certain packet of energy to get from some point to another point at a later time, and then get turned into what we actually want, which is the work at the end. And secondly, flowing on from that, how do we then break it into discrete projects that we can then actually turn into projects themselves? They can be financed. We can get private industry involved, as opposed to waiting for the golden path, which is probably going to need trillions of dollars of investment. So we need to do it in a way that we can break it into discrete, amortizable projects that actually have a return. And as a consequence of that, we're probably going to make some deeper gains into our carbon intensity reduction more quickly and more cost effectively by actually getting rid of the low-hanging fruit in terms of carbon intensive industries. These first few iterations, I think, will put us technically and commercially on the path that we become a leading player as we move further and further towards the net zero part of the graph. To say hydrogen is going to be cost effective with pulling gas out of the ground, I don't think it's going to happen. So in other words, it's got to come commercially from another way. And so obviously there needs to be an incentive for being less carbon intensive. And so whichever way you want to tiptoe around it, we need to increase the commercial incentives or the value in lowering our carbon intensity in whatever we do. And that then drives investment in itself, because they're now bankable projects, because they have a revenue stream on the back of it. But without that part of the discussion, we just keep going around in circles.